Today, I'm really appreciated to present our topic of climate change in Zanzibar, coastal communities, livelihood adaptation, and environmental justice in the Indian Ocean Region. Our paper based on the outline of introduction, methodology, findings, and conclusion recommendation. So, for the part of the introduction, the map highlights the Zanzibar strategic location within the Indian Ocean Trade Network. It showcases the historical connections between Zanzibar and other regions, including Arabian Peninsula, India, China, and Europe. This connection is facilitated with the exchange of goods, idea, and culture. However, Zanzibar coastal position is dependent on the marine resources, making it vulnerable to climate change impacts such as sea level rise, coral bleach, extreme weather events, and coastal livelihood depletion. And the life experience of Zanzibar coastal communities rely heavily on the natural resources, where the community depend on fishing activities, seaweed farming, and tourism, where it is the primary livelihood activity that undertaken to the particular area. So this one calculated to the GDP of 4 to 5% from the fisheries and tourism, and it is over the 27% for seaweed farming. The culture and tradition of Zanzibar is intertwined with the languages, religious, and observance of the strong community spirit of sharing and helping each other. However, there is a challenging of climate vulnerability in terms of temperature increase, shifting of rainfall pattern, and the increasing of the frequencies that make the incidence nowadays, it is intensifying, and the frequency is really harshing the real environment of the local communities. So from this situation, there is the adaptation for the people, and starting from the individual people to see how they can adapt with this situation and scale up to the governmental level, now approaching to the blue economy policy. So in terms of the local community, how for themselves they diversify their livelihood in order to adapt for these challenges. They try to shift from subsistence farming and now engaging to the commercial agriculture activities like aquaculture of seaweed and sea cucumber. And doing also the small businesses that are related directly to the marine resources. Also, based on this community-based adaptation initiative, another one is related to the microloans, and also for the environmental perspective, they try to restore the mangrove in the area. However, there is environmental and social justice in the particular area, where related directly to how they are competing to the natural resources that are on the coast. And this competition is linking between the local communities and for those who are investing to the tourism activities. And this competition making, for example, the local communities and particularly the women lagging behind to those adaptation measures that are taking on ground from the governmental level or international level. So the perspective or theoretical frame of this paper is related to the three theories of climate change, environmental justice, and vulnerability. We are looking to the variable of temperature and rainfall change that are linking directly to the coastal resources, and the socio-economic factors that the issue of occupation, gender, and income and knowledge. And also looking to the resilience factors that are related to the community capacity and the access to the resource. And also they are looking for the issue of cultural practices that are taking place in the area. Also for the issue of the governmental level, they now are changing from the way of using to how to manage and utilize the natural resources of the coastal, and now engaging directly to the blue economy policy. And the last approach is linking directly to the environmental and social justice that linking to the issue of distribution of social and environmental burdens and benefits, and how disproportionate the climate change impact to adaptation among the men and women. So the methodology of this paper is linking directly to the longitudinal design, which is tracking the change over time, to the climate data and the socioeconomic data. And also, we use the archival record as a data source, government reports, meteorological agents, and online material, and finally, we do the fieldwork. The data analysis technique get the modern PowerPoint, sorry. For data analysis technique, we use the time series analysis and thematic review. And finally, we come up with the presentation of the statistical finding, charts and graph, themes, and pattern of this. So the key finding is related directly to the climate change impact in Zanzibar and vulnerability to the coastal community and environmental justice that linking directly to this small area. So for the issue of climate change impact of Zanzibar, we see over the 100 years temperature data of the maximum, we see there is a shifting of around 1 degree centigrade from 1960s up to now. And this one connecting directly to how the pattern of the rainfall are changing or shifting and making very disturbance to the local community in terms of how they can engage to the primary subsistence farming, aquaculture, seaweed, and fishing. And the notable extreme of the event in Zanzibar is throughout the history. Zanzibar has experienced the period of intense storm and highly variable temperature and rainfall, which threatened the commercial farming of cloves, coconut, and fishing activities was in 1980s, and high frequency of dry spell and localized food shortage in 2009 to 2012, the stronger wind and heat wave that previously recorded in 2004, and coral bleach attributed to the El Nino event was in 1997 to 1998, coral floods in urban Unguja, 2007, coastal floods in Arable Land in Pemba, 2010 and 11, the highest temperature ever recorded of 39.4 degrees centigrade in February in 2007, and extreme rainfall, such as event in April 2005, where about 474 millimeters were recorded in just of 24 hours in Zanzibar Airport weather station. And this was the last time extreme rainfall event was recorded in 2044. And in 2018 also, there is a strong rainfall that are making a flash floods in so many areas where some roads are really blocked and are not passing through over 2 to 3 weeks until the rainfall is finished. So the vulnerability of the coastal community is linking directly to the natural resource depletion, rising of sea level, health risk, increasing in temperature, change in rainfall pattern, and extreme weather events. And this one, making the livelihood of the local community of Zanzibaris, some of them continue up to now, but some of them shifting or changing. So historically, we see that between the historical and the contemporary livelihood in Zanzibar are influenced of the complex interplay of factors, including the climate change, environmental change, population growth, development, and political trend. While some aspects of traditional livelihood have persisted, like the subsistence farming, the significant shift have been occurred over the historical livelihood. For example, for the historical part, the livelihood is subsistence farming, and particularly is shifting cultivation and fishing. These were primary livelihood for the centuries, shaped the local communities' traditions, knowledge, and environmental connection to the colonial era. This colonial period introduced the large scale of plantation export-oriented in terms of agriculture of cloves and spices, leading the Zanzibar to be the central of the commercial trade and make a significant change in the land use and livelihood. For the post-independence period, the focus shifted toward the national development and economic growth with the mixed result from the local communities. But when we look to the contemporary area or contemporary livelihood, there is so many challenges that are related directly to the environmental and climate change degradation and population growth. This one exacerbates the livelihood of the Zanzibar, making the decline of traditional livelihood of overfishing, habitat degradation, market fluctuation, and negatively impacted to the fishing community. This emerges the new livelihood of tourism, seaweed farming, and small-scale business. It is emerged as an alternative for this source of income. However, these factors are also vulnerable to climate change and economic shocks, where the diversification of the livelihood for many individuals is now engaging to the multiple livelihood to cope with these uncertainties to reduce the risk. So the community-based resource management for the local communities are increasingly also involved in managing the natural resource sustainability. The government support by the policy of blue economy nowadays is looking to see how the local communities are really adapted to these challenges of environmental and climate in particular. In this way of looking, this impact of climate change also related to the issue of gender, because climate change impacting the local community of Zanzibar very different compared to men and women. And for the issue of the women, we see that there is an equal distribution of environmental harm. For example, there is extraordinary challenges to women, where the disparity between cost and reward they are using to engage in seaweed farming, it makes that the invisible workload, it makes that they use the heavy investing cost, but receiving the little amount of money. For example, nowadays, the local community, they are used to engage to the seaweed farming for about 1.5 to 2 months, and they harvest the seaweed farming, but they use for only 700 per kilo of the seaweed. When you calculate, at least for the income they get to the monthly income they get, it is really limited to serve for them for their food and even to sustain for other issues. Okay, also there is invisible workload to the post-harvest fishing processes that ensuring the food security of families and generating income through the sales. However, there is a labor often goes undervalued. This make the local communities who are engaging, particularly the women who are engaging in these processes, are not considered much that the one who are increasing the GDP of the government. Also, there is the issue of access to beachfront of seaweed farming. Engaging on the big program, also the women are lagging behind in this one, and particularly due to the culture and the level of education. Also, there is a lack of representative and participation in the decision of how to engage in the program of climate change adaptation in the particular area. This one makes the potential challenging to the women, where majority of them facing challenge even while they are engaging in this program. Also, for the issue of climate change, make another problem because the local communities who are engaging in these livelihood activities that are particularly fishing, due to the climate change impact, reducing the fish stock in the area, where the men decide to adapt in this scenario by engaging to go to the campsite to the other area of the country, for example, in Kenya and south of Tanzania, where the local community of women, they are lagging behind to the Zanzibar area. They fish the potential infidelity for those majority fishermen who are extended the campsite to the area. Because previously they do this one about 1 to 3 months to go to the campsite, but nowadays they extend the time by taking longer for 6 up to 9 months to be out of Zanzibar, where the women and children are in the home. So this one creates very problematic to the women and make a problem in terms to the issue of health and even to the income. Also, there is a shifting power dynamics where the men who are going to the campsite, leading the women to additional responsibility while the men are away of their home. So from those challenges, Zanzibar government try to engage in this adaptation initiative to see how they can reduce this problem to the local communities. And now we are engaging to the blue economy as adaptation, but also there is a progress and obstacle on doing this one. Where the blue economy of Zanzibar have the 5 priority areas where the fishing and aquaculture, tourism, marine trade and infrastructure, energy of oil and gas and renewable, and the blue economy governance. This one progressing in introducing, for example, for fisheries and aquaculture. Nowadays, there is a new vessel because previously, the local communities using the local vessels to go for the fishing, but nowadays, there is a new vessel. They are giving the fishing gears that help them to go further for fishing activities. And also there is introduction of hatcheries to see for those who are engaging to the aquaculture farming in sea cucumber to have the fingerling production in order to sustain in their farming or aquaculture activities. Also, there is increasing of awareness about the ocean resources management and conservation, and also there is a training that are related particularly for the women who are engaging in the marine. For example, nowadays, due to the climate change impact, the seaweed farming is not really grown to the near shore of the coastal communities, and the local community should go to the deeper water in order to plant their seaweed. So majority of the Zanzibari, they are not have, particularly for women, they are not good in swimming. So nowadays there is a training that are provided to see how they can swim in order to go for the deeper water for aquaculture farming of seaweed. And also there is a potential investment opportunities in the tourism and recreation, where now the thinking is to make the low volumes and high ends. It means that reduce the number of tourism, particularly in the Pemba area, in order to sustain the culture and ecological function, but to make the high end, it means that returns to Zanzibar. And nowadays they are thinking to the sports tourism of skydiving and kite surfing to see how it will be sustainable for the local communities, as now there is a competition between for those who are working in the area, for the tourism, and the local communities who are dependent on this. So in order to reduce that, they try to look for the marine spatial planning to see how they can work on this between for those who are investing in tourism and for those who are continuing for their aquaculture activities. And also there is the issue of maritime trade and infrastructure, where over 99% of Zanzibar international trade volume is seaborne. So in this one, previously we used to this marine port for our importing our product from outside. But now we are thinking about the multi-purpose ports that are now already starting to be infrastructure to the Mangapani area north of Unguja or Zanzibar. And for the issue of investment opportunity and energy, now there is a potential discovery of oil and gas where on the Zanzibar offshore, and now they are in the discussion how we can exploit this one. And also for the issue of blue economy governance, there is an ICT solution for the blue economy governance, which are related directly to the surveillance to enhance the drone uses, to the underwater drone and to the on-land drone in order to see how we can surveillance all maybe negative issues that are used in the ocean. And also there is a port of offshore facilities solution that increasing the number of, increasing the notification of early warning sign for those climate issues. So even if there is this progress on that, but also there is an obstacle in the area where there is a limited investment, coastal resource degradation really continue in the area, climate change also impacting, persistence of bad fishing practices that are done for themselves, Zanzibari, and other people from the outside of Zanzibar. And there is a lack of technical and skilled labor by professionals. For example, now we are engaging to the blue economy activities, but the professional of this one, particularly for the issue of marine spatial planning, is really limited. And also there is a limited local community engagement for those who are not directly linking to the issue of coastal resources exploitation. Because now many of them, they are going to the small business engagement instead of going directly to the natural resource exploitation. So from these challenges and perspective, we come up with the conclusion of this one to see how Zanzibar will be at least sustained to these challenges of blue economy. So Zanzibar, there is a need to the coastal community for the conclusion. Zanzibar coastal communities are highly vulnerable to the climate change impact, and this one includes the sea level rise, coastal resources depletion, extreme weather event, and also there is a climate change significant effect to the traditional livelihoods such as fishing and agriculture, leading to reduced income and food security. Also, there is a coastal ecosystem depletion, which include the coral reef and mangrove that are facing the degradation due to the human activities and also climate change, as we say that about the coral bleaching. Also, there is an impact of climate change disproportionate to affecting the marginalized communities, particularly for the women, which exacerbates the existing social and economic inequalities. Also, there is a coastal community in Zanzibar have a limited capacity to adapt to the climate change due to the factors such as poverty, lack of education, and weak governance. So the recommendation is that in order to do better in this situation, there is a need to empower the local communities to develop in the implementation of their own adaptation strategies using at least the indigenous knowledge. Also, bridging the gap to marginalized groups or communities, particularly for women, to have a voice in decision-making, to see how they feel the issue of impact or the challenge of climate change, and how to go hand in hand to get in assistance and help to see how they can survive in this scenario. Also, there is a need to strengthen the government's institution to promote the transparency and accountability in their participation. Because when you ask for the local communities, majority of them, they say that, oh, we just received this initiative that are already planned to the government or for those who are coming to us. So we don't know how this one are really formulated. For example, nowadays there is a program of engaging the women in the blue economy activities. But those engagement, it is already planned from the government or for those partners who are coming to the countries to see how the local community is really engaging in that. And majority of them, they are really weird when they come for this one. They say that because we are the one, we are facing these challenges, and we know how this challenge is impacting us. But we have a limited voice to talk for those issues and just receiving how we can go with this situation. So what we used to do is to accept this one because we have the issue of limited in terms of money and other issues. So we receive the project and we implement, but once it is finished, it means that we continue with our business or the way how we live in this situation. So in order to have a good implementation or helping for those who are really marginalized, it is better to come and sit together to make a co-creation of how they can adapt for this scenario instead of giving them the program that are really already formulated to them without engaging to see how they are really impacted on that. Also, there is a need to investment in terms of education and healthcare infrastructure. This one will also help to improve even the living standard of the local communities. Also, there is a need to increase the provision of training and capacity building to the large community, which enhances the community resilience. For example, nowadays for the blue economy, they try to provide the training and awareness about the issue of climate change and how to swim in order to go to the deeper water for the seaweed farming. But this training are received for the very little number of the women. And the majority of them, when you ask, why you not practice the deeper water aquaculture, they say that we don't go there because it is not easy for us to go there because we have no ability to swim. And when you ask how many they receive this training, for example, for one village, they say only 2 women who are young ones, they receive this training. So the area where there is, for example, 2005, and receive only 2 to 5 maybe members in training, it means that it is not easy for the issue of maybe helping them. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. My paper is going to be a bit historical. I'm a historian by training. but my interest in the Red Sea grew out of an earlier SSRC project that I did with Natalie Puetz and Dea Al-Rusan. Natalie Puetz of NYU Abu Dhabi and Dea Al-Rusan of Hashemite University in Jordan. And that project ended up doing a series of perception surveys in 7 countries around the Red Sea. And we did impact surveys on livelihood in Djibouti amongst nomadic populations. And you can find the data for that project at www.redseanet.org. And that's grown into another project that I'm working on with 2 economists named Divika Dutt and Nara Sarathan that looks at different pathways for green transitions in the Gulf countries, in the GCC countries, and how that might impact labor-sending countries and their economies as we think about pathways to the future. And the reason I'm telling you all about that is because it deals with what's pushed me into this historical project, which is how to think about the Red Sea region and how we define the Red Sea region as a region of vast inequality. And today, in the United States, where I come from, the Red Sea region is often imagined as a bit of a problematic region, as a security concern, and as a region to be managed. But this project hopes to go back into the 1970s, into a time in which, if we look at a famous article by the Kenyan academic Ali Mazruhi, we see the 1970s, this imagination in which actually Sharjah plays a really important role. And I'll talk a little, hopefully in the book that will come out of this in 1976, we'll talk a little bit about the Sharjah conference here at the Africa Institute. And there's an imagination that was widely perceived amongst both African academics and people here in the GCC, which I guess the GCC didn't exist yet, but in the newly independent UAE, that there would be a synthesis, that there would be, that the merger of these 2 regions and the final achievement of independence in the Gulf would actually lead to a reconciliation between Africans and Arabs and to new economic possibilities and growth. And so a lot of the project that I'll discuss today deals with kind of challenges to that idea that there would be an incredible synthesis between the Gulf countries and the African continent, and then maybe growing pessimism with that idea as time has gone on, are the challenges that have arisen. But the idea in the title, of which I'm hoping the book will be eventually called The Afrabians, Afrabia itself is a frame that also comes from Ali Mazruhi in 1991 in another article that he wrote in the magazine Ujama, in which he talks about the necessity of the reconciliating between Africans and Arabs. And he also talks about the Red Sea as not a boundary of the African continent any more than the Sahara is, but actually Africa as extending, across the Arabian Peninsula into here, into the Gulf, and imagining that as all part of a kind of African unity. And so a lot of the project is about thinking about the different ways we might imagine this geographical space. And hopefully not as the US State Department imagines it as a problem, but also perhaps as an opportunity. My research on this actually started with an encounter with the Sudanese artist, fashion designer, activist, Mayada Adel. I was in Sudan, it was in Khartoum in 2018, 2019, and I had a number of conversations with her. And I remember one of the things that was striking was her turn to a kind of neo-Nubian art forms for her fashion designs, but also the explanation of why she was doing this. She talked to me a lot about returning from Saudi Arabia and coming back after partition, and there being this longing for a kind of, for a Sudan that used to exist, a Sudan that was, had this huge population of Southern Sudanese, and that her sense that there was an absence, and that being a motivating factor for her turn to a kind of neo-Nubian design. But it pushed in me a sort of theoretical question I'm still working on, and I hope to investigate further, which is how does the idea of Africa change for the Sudanese population in the diaspora in the Gulf countries? And in what ways do the Gulf countries, does the presence being in the Gulf countries create new ideas of Africa, and how can those ideas be used as political, social, and cultural projects? And I think there's many ways that's beyond the scope of what I'm going to talk about today, but we can think about the ways in which in the Sudanese revolution of 2019, new ideas of Africa come to the foreground. And I think a lot of those ideas are ideas that are cultivated here in the Gulf countries. And this project in many ways was a change for me in thinking about what it meant for economic ideas, inequality, culture, all these things from my first book, which was called Transforming Sudan, and which took an earlier period of economic development in Sudan as its jumping off point. I looked at the ways in which the Sudanese Ministry of Finance began to think about Sudan as an economic unit in the 1950s and 1960s, and the ways in which it thought about economic development. And in many ways, the ways in which it thought about economic development, I argue, only exasperated tensions within Sudan and also hardened lines between what we think of as between Arab and African Sudan and ideas of center and periphery. In many ways, those were the products of economic decisions taken in the 50s and 60s. But my current research today focuses on a Sudanese scholar, Muhammad Abul Qasim Haj Hamid, and I became interested in him in that kind of weird way as an intellectual historian that I found an artifact which was curious to me, and which I'm sure many people in this room, maybe it's not as curious as I thought it was, but as a grad student in Princeton, one of my best friends was Eritrean and working on the Ethiopian Civil War, and I was so excited that day I found this book in the Princeton Library, and I was like, who is Haj Hamid, and what is his story of fighting in the Eritrean War for independence, and what are these international aspects of the battle for Eritrea? And so eventually, when I finished the first book, I turned back to this book, and it's a curious story in which Haj Hamid becomes a propagandist for the Eritrean Liberation Front and later the EPLF, based out of Beirut, and his task is to sell the idea of Eritrean independence in the Arab capitals. But it also made me think a lot about what is, how do we write African history using, using sources coming out of places like Abu Dhabi and Doha and the newspapers that Haj Hamid would write in the UAE as sources for African history. And so a kind of new history of Africa and thinking about this region also as one sort of region. And all of this goes into a larger book project that I'm writing, The Afrabians, Anti-Imperialism After Decolonization Across the Red Sea. And so hopefully the book will start in the late 1960s in the famous Arab League conference in Khartoum, and think about this question of what happened to a country like Sudan after the kind of early developmental state sort of project sort of fails. And one of the things I argue is that that was part of a larger sense of malaise in the late 1960s, after the defeat of the '67 war, but also this idea that Haj Hamid, in one of his first books, will argue that independence cannot occur in one country alone, right? And so he talks about the crisis of Sudan and its, even its democratic struggles in the 1960s as being the crisis of achieving independence in a single country, but being surrounded by, what he calls countries that are still imperialist. And at the time, he means Ethiopia. He talks about the Congo, but one can imagine this problem as existing maybe even into the present. And so for Haj Hamid, his answer is committing to the Ethiopian revolution, the overthrow of Haile Selassie and moving to Beirut, and then imagining what could be a regional commitment or a regional struggle for independence. And then, like many people, Haj Hamid becomes a success. I mean, like many Sudanese, Haj Hamid goes to Beirut, and in Beirut he becomes a successful newspaperman, a writer, a propagandist. But there is a movement away from Beirut in the 70s with the breakout of the Lebanese Civil War, and Haj Hamid follows that movement, coming to Sharjah and then Abu Dhabi, where he becomes an employee of the Emirates. And there, I'm trying to think about the ways in which his story is representative of the story of many Sudanese professionals at that time coming to the Gulf states and their contribution to the creation of the state bureaucracy in the Gulf states themselves. And then from there, he joins what sometimes is called the Islamization of Knowledge Project, but he becomes part of a coalition of intellectuals, often in exile or in diaspora from their own home countries, who are thinking about what it would mean to have an Islamic republicanism or the problem of Islam and democracy during the long 1980s, and what reform might look like. And Haj Hamid journeys during that part, and I want to argue in some ways that we often think about the Islamic Revolution in Sudan in 1989 in isolation, but that it occurs as part of this longer, as part of this debate that's occurring transnationally, and out of many people who actually find their start here in the Gulf states. But the problem of Sudan then becomes another problem in the 1990s, where do we place Sudan, with the successful revolution in Ethiopia, Uganda, Eritrea? Can Sudan fit into that matrix of a kind of new Pan-Africanism, or does the Islamic nature of the Sudanese state in the 1990s make it a problem? And I'll talk in a minute about his ideas of a confederation of the Horn of Africa as one possible answer to this problem, but why is that impossible? And then finally, the book will end on a bit of a sad note as Haj Hamid dies in 2004, and it deals with this question of why do each of the states, instead of finding a kind of regional identity, they all find their own relationships with the United States for different reasons. And so I talk about the Red Sea becoming a kind of American lake. And then in the conclusion, I ask, what does anti-imperialism look like after decolonization? And so the book in many ways takes off from the Sharjah conference in 1976, and this idea that Ali Mazrouhi writes that, the independence finally of the Gulf states in the early 1970s is a wonderful opportunity, right? Because it's an opportunity for the human talent from the African continent to come here and the capital from the Arab states to go into Africa, and there to be this virtuous symbiotic relationship. And you even see people like Haj Hamid write that, the independence of the UAE is the final fulfillment of African independence. And it's a long story for him from the 50s onwards into the 1970s, and that's all connected. And you see E.C. Chibwe, the Zambian economist, talking about Arab dollars for Africa. Dunstan Y uses this new phrase, the triangle trade, which I found to be very evocative in ways in which it thinks about slavery. But he says this will be a new triangle trade in which, the harms done previously will be repaired, and that Africa provides the perfect opportunity for the Gulf states not to have to send their money back to Europe and the United States, but to actually find a kind of virtuous investment cycle. And so, obviously, this relationship does not happen in the ways in which maybe it was imagined in the mid-1970s, but I think it's still important to think about that as a potential opportunity. And one of the challenges, turning back towards Sudan, is what would be the vision of the Sudanese state after somebody like Haj Hamid is writing in the mid-1990s. He actually spends most of the 1990s in Asmara, where he finds himself under the protection of Isaias Afwerki. But he's proposing this idea, he always turns back to this kind of Afrabian idea. He sometimes calls it an African Sufism, but he's looking for something that can exist between what he sees as the African secularism of John Garang, and he thinks is the wrong-headed Arabism of Hassan al-Turabi, and what would exist as a sort of synthesis for a Sudanese identity in this context. And for him, writing in his two-volume book of Sudan, which is republished in 1996, he goes back to the Kingdom of Kush, right? And for him, the idea is that it is only in Cushitic Sudan that you see a synthesis between all of Sudan's various parts. And he says, Sudan has he takes this 5 sort of races approach to Sudan, but for him, it's that Kingdom of Kush period in which you see a kind of natural intellectual synthesis for the Sudanese project, and can you return to that, and what would that mean for a Sudanese identity going forward? And his answer politically is what he calls the Confederation of the Horn of Africa. And this is an idea that was often championed by Isaias Afwerki in the mid-1990s, but for him it's useful because it escapes what he says are these binary conditions that he thinks have harmed both Sudan, but also Ethiopia, Eritrea, define the whole Horn. And in many ways, in thinking about the conflicts now, you can see that there is, while this is a kind of utopian project, perhaps, there is a certain logic to it, right? He says, in Sudan, there's the conflict of Arab and Africans, Muslims and Christians. How do you break that from being a binary conflict? Or in Eritrea, or in Ethiopia, and he often talks about the problem of a need for a Tigrayan confederation, but you can see, that in a way, in the 1990s, he's seeing into the future that there will be these sort of conflicts which will tear apart these states. But he doesn't think he thinks that will only increase the sort of vulnerability of these states and increase the ability of outsiders to sort of intervene, and that it will become a sort of never-ending cycle. And in the 90s, he's often talking about the problem for Sudan of entering what he calls a Somalia scenario. And so this idea that fracturing is sort of a threat that's omnipresent, for him the answer is actually sort of defining this region. And he has this idea that the peoples from Somalia all the way through Sudan are actually sort of one sort of peoples, and that this is a region that can be put together in this confederation, and from there it can have a different geopolitical relation to its neighbors. And for me, a lot of these ideas kind of came out of also interviewing people right before the uprisings in 2019 at the Center for Development and Public Policy, which was a new think tank in Sudan. And I was interested in, having written that first book, you're always interested in when people say something like Sudan had never had a developmental state, but because I was like, I think they have, but it was interesting to meet a group of younger people who had been chosen in many ways because of their relationship to the National Congress Party, but they were youths, and they had all done their undergraduate degree inside Sudan and done their masters abroad, and they were thinking about ways in which they could reform the Sudanese state from the inside. And in many ways, they were thinking about the question of whether or not you could create a developmental state in Sudan. And also, it was an interesting moment because they were also looking at places like Ethiopia as useful models for Sudan, which I also found to be interesting. And this question of what it would take to sort of create a new apparatus inside Sudan. And they thought a lot about Haj Hamid, because one of the things that I think made Haj Hamid a sort of attractive thinker at that moment was that even though Haj Hamid had remained what we might say broadly an Islamist, He had never joined the regime itself, and so he was in this sort of middle space thinking about different possibilities for the Sudanese state, different possibilities for the Sudanese future. And then Haj Hamid is also a thinker who has thought a lot about the region itself. And so later in Haj Hamid's later writings, he's thinking a lot about if regionalism had taken off, if there had been a sort of closer tie between the different states around the Red Sea, what could have happened instead of what happens in the end. And there's a lot of inside Haj Hamid where you also see this question of what happens when the states are broken into smaller pieces. And so I think some of these questions still remain really important for us now. And going back to the very beginning, when we started doing this research on climate change, and one of the first things we did is we tried to find researchers in each of the 7 countries, each of the countries we could around the Red Sea Basin. And we started to find that there are tons of national plans, right? And so, one thing that you do see a lot of for climate change adaptation is that most of the plans are happening at the national level. There is very little thinking about what it would mean to do climate change adaptation around the Red Sea as a whole. And there's also very little thinking about what will how the national plans will affect the region as a whole. And so you could see like the plans from Saudi Arabia, plans from UAE, plans from Jordan. We also found that countries like Yemen had been some of the first to do this sort of national planning for climate change, but they were unable to, in many ways, complete their plans that are already adapted. But from Haj Hamid, you get this sort of idea that one of the things that's missing is that there hasn't been able to be, since the early 2000s, a sort of regional sense, right? Or sort of regional understanding or regional outlook towards the rest of the world. All right, thank you guys again.
Assalamu alaikum. I'm very happy to be here, and I thank you very much for the opportunity to present part of the research that I've been working on. And you will note that there is a little bit modification on the title so that I can focus it better from the one I submitted on the abstract. And now the title is on climate crisis and the threatened opportunities in the Indian Ocean region, evidence and ethical responses from the coastal communities in Tanzania. Since 2020, I have been engaged in research with my colleagues, thanks to the funding from the University of Dar es Salaam, from the Social Science Research Council in the US, and from the network of universities under the Climate U project. And I also want to acknowledge and thank my colleague in that group, Sunil, for his input during this research process. So, as I said, since 2020, I was triggered and had wanted to know, given the climate change phenomena that we experience, how do coastal communities face climate change? How do they face climate change? And the other thing which I had wanted to know, if they are doing whatever they do, what can we learn from them on preparing or civilizing what other people have said as ecological citizens? What can we learn from this kind of community? So as I said, coastal communities experience rising surface temperatures, rising sea level, severe coastal floods, damaging windstorms, cyclones, and salinization of water sources. This is well noted, and therefore this kind of climate change effects have negatively affected coastal areas and people's coastal and oceanic livelihood opportunities. So We've been engaging this kind of research in the two coastal communities of Somanga and Songosongo in Kira district to gather their insight into their awareness of the climate crisis, their responses, and the kind of ethics that inspire and guide their climate actions. And this is where the research sites are located. It is within the Indian Ocean. Songosongo is an island within the Indian Ocean, which has a lot of deposits on gas. So if you have heard about Songosongo gas in Tanzania, this is the area. And it's dependent on a lot of coastal and oceanic resources. Somanga is also a coastal community in the same area, but it's not an island, so it's not a coastal community with access to coastal and marine resources, but also the land resources. And so this is where they are situated. So after conducting this research for 4 years in this community, I'm just going to share with you some of the findings that we have gathered. And one of the findings that I want to share is the local people's thoughts on the ocean and its potential opportunities. How do they perceive the ocean, the sea? How do they relate with the sea? And what do they see as the potential as far as the ocean or the sea is concerned to them? So one of the things that we had been asking the coastal community and observing them in their daily interaction with the sea is, apart from the sea having water, what are the other components in the sea? So they've been telling us that there are non-living things, like the minerals, the stones, but there are also plants, there are animals, and spirits. All of these have their own agency, which can influence the different ways of engaging and using the opportunities that the sea provides. And the second dimension has been, how do they connect with the sea? So the sea, for them, and this is what they say, the sea is our life. Without the sea, we cannot survive. And the sea gives them identity. They say we are the people of the sea. The sea they are part of the ocean or the sea, and they are ocean or sea people. And all this, see their perspective, they are shaping their way of relating and exploiting or interacting with the ocean itself. But it also goes, you hear them say, our lives and prosperity depend on the sea, and probably our life and the poverty is also associated with the way we exploit, or we fail to exploit the potential that the sea provides to us. And the other dimension that when you hear people speaking about the sea, their thoughts is what kind of opportunities are related to the sea. And I have summarized here 5 opportunities. One is the social opportunities. This is the ocean-shaped identities. When people feel that we are people of the sea, we are not people of the land, like some of us, or we are coastal people because they are along the ocean, and they are fishing community because they exploit the fisheries resource in the sea. And as I said, all these are the opportunities, but also has an implication on the way they deal with the sea. Another opportunity is cultural opportunities that the sea provides them with spaces for practicing rituals and reconnecting with benevolent spirits and ancestors. Because some of the spirits, as I said, are within the sea. Some of the good ancestors are also in the sea, having their agents and influencing their life and interaction with them. And the third opportunity, the economic opportunities, opportunity to extract renewable and non-renewable oceanic resource to fulfill human and societal needs. They engage in fishing, farming, like the seaweed that we heard, and also mining. Then, the sea also provides them with political opportunities, including the space for local, national, and regional politics to influence the governance of marine and the coastal resources, oceanic resources within the country, but within their community, but also at the regional level. And the last opportunity that we have noted and is an environmental opportunity, spaces for them for promoting environmental sustainability through conserving, protecting, and restoring marine and coastal ecosystems. All these are the opportunities that they have noted. And the second finding that we have was related to the awareness of the climate crisis and its impact. And we wanted to learn from them. Instead of asking them what's climate change, what does it do, our approach was starting from the kind of opportunity that they have and how climate change, if it's all happening, how is it influencing or affecting their opportunities. So, and the kind of evidence that are available that we could check on and see where this is the case. So we noted that, for example, from the Somanga village, this is one of the village, that they have been experiencing detrimental floods, and it's well documented that in 1995, they experienced one of the waste floods, and has a lot of impact on their produce in the farming and other properties in the area. But also they experienced farming associated with drought. So they had also had drought in 1997. So elders will tell all these kind of stories and the kind of impact it had on them. Then there are residual torrential rain every year that causes road and bridge damages, because they are along the main road from Dar es Salaam to the southern part, so there is always those kind of train and the damages. One of the cases was last year, just last year it happened. So they had kind of, so it's a kind of impact that they live with daily, they are facing them. Songo village, they told us they have an unpredictable and below average rain that resulted in a low crop yield in 2013. That's when they had a lot of hunger within that island because of the low rainfall. Then intensified beach erosion due to the powerful southeast monsoon wind. If you go to their beaches, there a lot of erosion has taken place. But also they experience ocean water increasing, including natural wells. They depend on the natural wells for the water, drinking water. And this one has always been intruded by the ocean water, leading to a drinking water crisis. So out of the 4 natural water wells, only 2 now are the ones which are providing the kind of water that people could consume, leading to the crisis that we're talking about. But also they also experience hot temperatures that affected their seaweed growth. This is one of the areas they conduct seaweed farming, causing them to change from their natural color to yellow and then white, and therefore not attracting good income, because that was an impact of this. And last, the high sea surface temperature, that is above 27 centigrade, in 1998, 2005, 2016, and 2020, causing the bleaching and death of corals. And corals are the breeding space for the fish. But also, they say the degradation of more than 30 coral reefs which has resulted in the massive loss of biodiversity, weakened resilience, and the loss of habitats, leading to declining fisheries resource that people depend on. And of course, it's not only the climate change which also have affected this, but also the way, because of the declining of fishery resources, so the methods of fishing, including the bombing, have destroyed a lot of corals, and therefore affecting it. And there is also the coverage of the mangroves declined from 51 hectares in 1991 to 45 because people are cutting these mangroves as an alternative source to start other kind of activities like farming. And because of the mangrove degradation resulting in a decline in the prawn fisheries, which is one of an important fishing, and increased coastal erosion, which has led to a loss of property, land, and infrastructure. So all this is quite evident that climate change is real and they have to face it. And why they have to face it? Because it deprives them important opportunities that they need, not only to survive, but also to live because they are part of the ecosystem. So the other finding that we want to share with you is what have been their responses and what is informing these kind of responses. So they have engaged in a very innovative ways of dealing with the climate crisis. And the notable one is the voluntary community-based group that they have established to deal with these kind of challenges. So we noted, and we have been following and supporting these initiatives of 3 community-based organizations. One is Kiumama, which has 20 members, 7 male and 13 males, who use their own resources to deal with the coral reef rebuilding and the coral restoration activities. Why? We will see later what motivates them. But we also another group which is focused on Somanga Environmental Group with 19 members, 10 male and 9 female, who are engaged in mangrove restoration activities at Somanga. And they're using their own time and resources to do this because they had to try to deal with the challenges of climate change. And then we have another group, which is in Somanga. Has 16 members, 9 male, 7 female, who have embarked on climate change awareness campaign targeting the pupils because they know that they have also contributed to the kind of challenge that they are facing in the community, and they don't want to see that the same happens with the young one. They want the young one to be more of climate literacy and to engage in preventing and conserving the environment to avoid the drastic challenge that they are going through. So here are some of the photos of the activities on restoring coral reefs. And it is their own innovation, where they are planting the corals, the coral, on this kind of bridge that they have established. And so they take some seeds from the healthy ones and plant it, and then to restore those corals which have been. And this is the activity we also immersed in, trying to support them in what they do. So far, and this is how they restore, they put in the corals at the seabed to ensure that they thrive. They also monitor it to ensure that they are growing properly. So in 2022 until 2023, this is the kind of restoration activity that has taken place. And by January 2023, 6,918 corals have been planted, and they are constantly being monitored. There is a growth which is taking place now, and probably there were many to restore. So this was one of the pilot cases they were doing, and we supported them to do this, but there are other which they want to restore, but still want to learn from this kind of case and the innovation, how they could do it better. So imagine the people who engage in this activity, they will not benefit now. It is to do it in the system, probably with a benefit in the future. And another one is the mangrove restoration, which is being undertaken at the Somanga, which was destroyed, so they are actually replanting them. And this is the group which is doing it, male and female members. And this is how they do. And these are the statistics. By 2023 March, they had planted 17,755 mangroves in about 10 acres, and they're being monitored and taken care of using their own resources. Then this is a climate change awareness and actions involving pupils done by the Shiwama in Songo Songo. You know, engaging the student to learn from the environment, the impact of climate change, how humans have contributed to it, and how they could do differently to prevent some other detrimental situation in the future. So they're taking students, they're taking them to see the water wells, to see the kind of environment which is still the forests which are there, and the kind of activity they could do, including planting trees. Here is an example of the tree. And 20 of these students have planted, and they're carrying about 55 trees in one of the health center in the village. And they're still taking care of the planted tree. So, they are facing the challenges. They are engaging it so that to prevent them from losing the opportunities that are important for them. They're engaging in action using their own resources and the support that are available. The question is, now is the question of ethics. What inspired them to do these kind of things? And what inspired them, the kind of responsibility that they think they have to engage in all these kind of things. So from the analysis, from what we've been observing and hearing from them, at least we have captured four kind of responsibility that they attribute to themselves, and that make them engage in these kind of activities. One is the duty they feel that they have a duty to facilitate the meeting of human needs and goals. So because there are a lot of opportunities provided by the sea that every human can benefit from. So if they are destroyed, they have a duty to engage, to restore them so that eventually each one can be able to benefit from the resources and use them. And this one is associated on a strong African belief that one becomes a person among persons for fulfilling specified and valued communal goals. And this is a more of an anthropocentric goal, but also centered on self-realization. I do good things for my society, and restoring corals, mangroves, a good thing, which enable me to become and recognize as a good person in the society. Another duty, which is also ethical duty, that we see them attributing and embracing, is the duty to support survival and sustenance of other beings, especially the endangered species. There are a lot of guys in this group are really committed to ensure that they protect and support the regeneration of this kind of species which are endangered and they're protected. And this is a valued economic goal, but focused on non-human beings, and therefore a kind of non-anthropocentric goal. And the third one is the feeling of the duty to correct and restore previously destroyed ecosystem elements for the sake either of the ecosystem itself, its integrity, and therefore non-anthropocentric, or for the sake of human beings, so that eventually human being could benefit. And this one we note from the members of this group. Some of the people who are reading the coral restoration group are the ones who were involved in many ways to destroy the corals when they were doing the fishing, by fishing some kind of, using means which are destructive. So now they feel that obligation, we need to correct it. Okay? But some of the people who are engaged in the mangrove restoration are the ones who really destroyed almost the mangrove, and they feel that they have a responsibility to correct the kind of mistake they did. As I said, it has both combination of non-anthropocentric, but also anthropocentric goals. And the last one is a commitment to fulfill their ecological duties. In this kind of perspective, they see themselves a part of the sea, part of the ecosystem, of the marine ecosystem, but also the coast ecosystem. And therefore having a responsibility and ability to maintain the integrity of the system. That's why they do it, and they want to continue to doing it. And as a conclusion, I think based on this kind of perspective and they assume their responsibilities, I think that we can work out a kind of ethics of sustainability, or the kind of ethics that could inspire and guide our process of socializing and civilizing what other people have called ecological citizen. Thank you for listening.
Yeah, thank you for the presentations. It was really interesting for me. I'd like to introduce myself. I am a researcher in ecology. I'm a biologist. And I've been working in forest and marine ecosystems in Europe and North America for the moment. So I think it's quite interesting that throughout my career, we always tended to look at the climate and ecological crisis as an apolitical crisis. So, for example, when, the term Anthropocene that we use very often, as Malcolm Ferdinand puts it, it doesn't take into consideration the plurality of the human systems, and that, for me, the Anthropocene is something that has been caused by, basically European colonization. So now I'm also Sudanese, so since the Sudanese revolution, I became much more interested in doing research in Sudan. But for me, it became very important to include politics, also like political vision when I do ecological research. So what I'm interested in is that I'm asking a lot of questions about how to approach the climate crisis and adaptation projects implementation, because we know that in Sudan, for example, they're mostly inefficient because they have like this top-down approach. So how can we change that while reinforcing local communities, governance, and appropriation of climate action? So that's, if you have any thoughts around that. Like from an organizational perspective, like practically. That's my question. Thank you.
Thank you. If I understand, you mean you need to know how local communities are engaging in...
Like for the moment, like what's happening is that it's a top-down approach, so communities actually don't have a say on how to conceive the adaptation projects, or what are their local knowledge, integrate their local knowledge and solutions. That's because of the structure of the system that, it's like a top-down. So that NGOs come and then they come with their ideas of what should be done.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, for the case of Zanzibar, for example, there is a top-down system, where majority of the local communities, they just receive what it is already planned for them. So in order to change this situation, it means that better to go way around. It means that bottom to top down. It means that when we need to initiate anything that really needs to be engaged in the local community, it means that there is a need to create the, for example, situational analysis and getting the knowledge and understanding of the people to see how they really perceive those challenges. For example, even to design or to make the co-creation of those initiatives that are need maybe to be in place in the particular area. And this one example, for majority of the local community, once they are engaging to the initiation, to the initiative, it means that they just working on those initiatives, but they have their local understanding of those, also they have their own local understanding. So they try to practice what is already maybe planned, but in a background, they see that something maybe it is not really happen to, or maybe work to them. So better to have a co-creation first to see how to design those activities and initiative in order to be really, maybe work on that.
Thank you very much for that question, and I want to give you a concrete example from the coast communities in Kilwa district in Rand region. You know, with the marine spatial planning in Tanzania, they have allocated marine parks, which are enacted by the act of law, but also we have community-led parks. So for example, the area which we are conducting research, it involves 6 districts, the local government authority. They have their own plan and whatever, the kind of governance that is informed by their own knowledge and how they want to address that. And actually they're empowered to do so. And anybody who wants to come in, you don't bring your own ideas, you don't bring your own things. If you have the funding to support us, then support, this is what we are trying to do. So they have kind of ownership, and that's what I spoke about, the kind of politics space they have to influence the governance. And they have initiated a lot of activities. For example, I didn't mention, but we have octopus seasonal closure, in which they're managing it, and they are actually succeeding rather than the time where the government was involved. And all this initiative to the mangrove now, for example, restoration, is now taking place across all this area. The coral restoration now, other communities are adapting, and the local government in the area is supporting that. So recently, for example, the USAID have a project there with the Hashim Bahari project, where they want to do this. They say, no. You have to follow what you have to, because they have already a plan, and they're convinced on that, and that's what. So I think this is one area of empowering people and respecting climate action that are community-led. Thank you.
So that was an initiative from local community?
The local community. Yeah. The local community. Yeah. Yes.
Thanks. My question is to Alden. You situate the genealogy of, I noticed you are situating the genealogy of Ephraimian thought in the age of petroleum, right? I'm wondering if there were any specific discussion among this intellectual generation around petromodernity, their visions, regarding that, and if they had any connections during that time period with, sort of the labor movements that were kind of active across the Gulf during that time period.
Before you respond, can I just see if there are 2 more questions we can all take as a batch, right? So hold on one second. Oh, thank you so much.
Thank you to you all for your wonderful presentations. So my, not intervention, but I mean, I have questions one question and a comment. So, Mary, I like your presentation because it's a crossroads of many conceptual frameworks, and here I'm particularly thinking about temporalities of adaptation. You have the question of reconfiguration of spaces, and also ecology of power and global asymmetries, which the question that she raised came from. But then, Almas, there's a question of the ethics of climate responsibility. And going back to Mary, so you suggested that there is an intersection of adaptability and justice. So based on that intersection, I think the question that, two questions. So one is, what does it mean to adapt ethically in an unequal world that we're living in? And the second question is, I wonder if the narrative of adaptations risk, in a way, naturalizing, the question of vulnerability, in a sense that, you're turning it into a condition to be managed rather than, something that is a symptom of global systems in need of transformation.
Thank you. I really liked this panel. This is the panel and the ways in which this conference has been organized, I think, has followed this trajectory of inviting more scholars who are based in the region, and what does it mean to be located in those places and to think from them. I think this is a great example. Thank you so very much. Mary, in your presentation, you were saying we. Are you involved in community activism? Or were you just, referring to a group of researchers? The other question that I have for you is, in your recommendation, you have brought, investment in education, healthcare, and infrastructure. As we note, the challenges of neoliberalism to the African state and the complicity of the African state in these processes are really withdrawing investments from these sectors. These sectors are becoming privatized time and time again. So how do you see those recommendations? How are they going to be seen and really implemented with these challenges in the face of us? To Alden, my question is, interestingly, are you suggesting you have brought to the ocean Red Sea, not only Red Sea, but also the hinterland with all its political history? So are you suggesting that we need to have a constellation while we are foregrounding, for instance, the Indian Ocean? For Almas, it's interesting that communities' perception towards the sea, how they consider themselves very great. But how do other actors, local, global actors, figure into this scenario? Thank you.
Thank you for both those questions. I think in many ways I was thinking of petroleum and the takeoff of the petroleum industry and its expansion in the 1970s as one of the conditions for the problem that people like Haj Hamid are trying to deal with, which is that if you think of the 1960s, the balance of power between a country, say, like Sudan and a country, well, it's not an independent country like the UAE, is much different than it will be after the 1970s. And I think what many of these intellectuals are trying to grapple with, starting in the 70s, is how to make sense of that opportunity or that potentiality. And can you build ways in which that would be mutually reinforcing for countries both in Africa and in sort of the Arabian Peninsula? Or would it become a relationship of exploitation? And one of the main questions actually is a question of labor. What will be the condition of the labor that comes, both professional and manual labor that comes from the African continent into the Arab states, into the Gulf states, and what will be the rights of that labor going forward. And that, in many ways, is one of the struggles that sort of plays out in this period I'm trying to cover from '67 into the early 2000s. And there is a hardening of the boundaries that we all, of course, know. And that, I think, in many ways, the hardening of those boundaries around labor also become hardening of boundaries between countries, and the disparity of power grows much more dramatically. And that, I think, causes political problems that are difficult to deal with, but also ecological and climatic problems, because what will be the nature of climate change adaptation if decisions are made in locales that many of the people directly affected by will not be able to influence, right? So decisions, of course, made, you know, in UAE or Qatar or Saudi Arabia have vast impact on the neighboring countries. But the question is, what responsibilities are shared across those geographies? And I think the Red Sea is really interesting as an academic geography for us to think about, because it poses certain questions that I think are different than the ones posed by the Indian Ocean as a framework. The Indian Ocean, in many ways, is so vast that some of the questions of inequality or power disparities, I think, are more diffused in an Indian Ocean framework, whereas in a Red Sea framework, I think they come out much clearer. And so part of what I'm trying to work on is how should we think about those disparities across this geography?
Yeah, thank you very much for the good question that raised in the panel. So when we look to what does it mean about the adaptation justice? So based on the research is that the adaptation justice, it is better, for example, we know that the men and women receiving the climate change impact is very different. For the case of Zanzibar, we see that majority of men, they try to adapt for the impact of climate change, for example, for leaving their families at home and going to campsite for a long period of time and just living for their own without considering, for example, for their family at home. While the women who are remaining to the home, they take the responsibility of taking care for themselves and the children, struggling for finding food and other issues. So in order to come up with this adaptation justice, it means that we should see how we can make a climate action to see how for those, for example, local women who are residing at home and trying to adapt with this scenario, maybe improving in terms of understanding themselves and to have the voice of those burdens they are given from their men who are going outside, and to work on that to see how they can strive, and maybe even judging for those men, they just residing the women at home and while they are going outside. Also, this scenario of adaptation, for example, for those local communities who are going for campsite, or some of them, they are residing at home, the men, and trying to adapt for this climate change, but they just increasing the problem of that. Instead of doing the traditional activities of fishing like that, they used to do maladaptation for bad practice of fishing in order to try to find more and more and more for natural resources. So they strike to the coral. And also the adaptation risk, another one that are introduced for the local community is some of them, they try to adapt by diversifying their activities, for example, for extracting the coastal rocks and selling to other people for building. And this one also creating the problem, environmental degradation on that. So in order to think in this scenario, it means that we should find the way how the local communities, while trying to adapt in this scenario, should consider the good way of adaptation instead of leaving themselves in this situation. Another question is, are you the we in the research? This one, it is the continuation of the working group we work between me and my fellow members from the SSCRC grant, and I just do the extension of the research to see from those, the information I get from the previous study, and I continue to work in this one in order to see how this scenario of climate change and livelihood are going through to the area. So for the issue of recommendation, just thinking to provide to the study that it is better to recommend in this way, because there is a problem of low knowledge for the local communities themselves, and also even to the government who are practicing now the blue economy approach. Majority of the people who are working in the blue economy sector, they have limited skills on those issues. For example, now we are struggling for the marine spatial planning issues, but we have the expertise who are not really engaging or learn in these issues of marine spatial planning. That's why it is difficult even when we need to implement on that. And for those key areas that are introduced by the government, for example, for the fisheries and aquaculture, tourism, and maritime, and what. Also, when you look on that, see that it is quite difficult to implement because of the low knowledge, poor infrastructure, and other issues. That's why I recommend to improve those infrastructure, for example, and also to improve the training to the local communities and even the experts who are engaging in the institutional sector that are given to the area of blue economy. Thank you.
Thank you. My brother, on the question of various actors, yes, we have many actors, and all have different perspectives on how they view the sea. One of the actors is the government. And one of the villages that I mentioned, Songo Songo, they actually resisted some of the governance proposed by the government because it wasn't serving their interests. And the question has always been, to whom does the sea belong? For the community, they say the sea is God's sea, he gave us. So the government, you have no right to impose. And what is the government interested in? Is the resources to be there so that it can get it can collect money, it can investment, whatever. And sometimes these people don't care about the community. So the community that are empowered, and depending on that, for example, the study we are doing with SNIL in this community, they have designed their own governance system, resisting all the NGOs which were pro-conservation and the government, and their governance system is working better and actually is exemplary in Tanzania. So now the government is trusting them. And as regards other actors, the NGOs, international NGOs who conserve them, are they interested in what, do they have the same perception, this community? Are they interested? No, they don't. They are serving other purposes. Some of these communities are resisting those kind of intervention. If you want to do what we are doing, because we are committed and we see this is working for us. I gave an example of WWF, for example, has been working there for many years, but recently, because of the blue economy, which is taking a direction of the neoliberal, communities are resisting them to pursue a blue economy that is relevant and contributing to them. And also, regarding also the government, for example, and expertise in ecology, the biologists, they have always failed to understand that some of the problems that we have in the sea, in the ocean, in the lake, actually there are sources in the human and culture system. So unless we address that, we cannot. And that's why this community, they have been given the right to manage their own marine park, if we can say that. And the results are different. So, true, we have different actors with a different kind of value system, with a different kind of interests, and you need to have a community that takes seriously and values itself, and which is also adapting by setting up a good governance structure that support their vision in conserving, protecting the value that we saw here. Thank you.
Hello. So my name is Rose Boswell. I'm from South Africa. I was really interested in the presentation of Almas, your presentation. And the thing that struck me was the point that you made about the cleansing ritual. I think it was called Kukoga Mwaka, if I remember correctly. And I remember from past fieldwork in Zanzibar, on the mainland, that in the south of the island, there is obviously the other kind of almost like a cleansing ritual as well. I think it's called the Mwaka Kogwa, or maybe they inverted it. I wanted to know what, if any, connection there was between these two rituals. And then I think if there isn't, my second question then would be, how have these, I would say, indigenous cultural practices, how are these basically featuring in the broader narrative of climate change? Because I think you just mentioned it, like, quite swiftly, and it would be good to know if there are any local philosophical ideas or frameworks that are emanating from these practices that is then informing the response to climate change. Yeah, that's my question.
Thank you very much for that. When you go to the coast communities, they have some cultural practices, especially the ritual that they do. The Kukoga Mwaka, for example, that's a year ritual system they do for the cleansing, and also asking blessings for the future. And to me, it's a bit positive, but also contradictory. Because when you go and do the rituals and you throw everything, bad things that happened in the past, and you still want the sea to be clean and that kind of thing. So it's contradictory, but it makes sense that a sea can receive a lot of things which could also clean us and inform us to do better in the future. But what I found in the Songo Songo community, they do each year, when they do that kind of ritual, they recommit to protect the sea and the natural resources in the sea and the opportunities that are available. And regarding the philosophy that informing, you see, for a long time, people have thought that African philosophies, traditional philosophy, especially the Bantu philosophy, is more anthropocentric. But you see there are other elements which show that it's non-anthropocentric. So if you go back to the traditional African ways of thinking, especially as was highlighted in the Bantu philosophy, and the way we conceptualize a human being as part of this ecological community, having responsibility, there is a philosophy which is grounded. And this is what I'm trying to draw from this kind of research, to show that such kind of ethics, such kind of philosophy, which ordinary people are using, and they're shaping their own way of action toward that, it actually could be used to socialize our people so that they become more responsible ecological citizens. Thank you.